Well, the healthy and relatively unique fish habitat in the Kokish River will be at risk if a hydroelectric project is allowed to proceed. That's the position of some environmental groups in the wake of an approval issued by BC's Environmental Assessment Office. The Kokish River Hydroelectric Project, as it is officially called, will be located about 15 kilometers east of Port McNeill. It will produce enough electricity or to power 15,000 homes by diverting the river into a 9-kilometer long pipe ending up at a generating plant before the river itself. The province says this can be done safely with, quote, legally binding requirements designed to ensure the safety of the Kokish River ecosystem. But Gwen Barlee doesn't believe it. She's the policy director with the Wilderness Committee, and she's on the line with us now. Gwen, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Can you first of all tell us about the ecosystem and the fish population in the Kokish River today? Why is it important?
Well, it's a high-value fish stream, and it has a unique summer run of steelhead. It's home to coho, chum, chinook, dolly varden, so it has a rich abundance of salmon and trout and char. And the BC government has seen fit to put an industrial power project right in the middle of that fish habitat.
So what are the concerns as you see them with this hydroelectric project?
Well, there's a bunch of concerns, and the primary concern is that when you're diverting, you can be diverting up to 60, 70, 80% of the stream, sometimes more, through a pipe called a penstock. And that doesn't leave enough water in the stream sometimes for fish habitat. And it's been an ongoing problem with these run-of-river power projects that you'll have the proponent, they'll commit to leaving a certain amount of water in the stream. And oftentimes that doesn't happen because you don't have people going out on the ground from, let's say, the Environmental Assessment Office. They don't have a field presence. So they aren't checking to make sure that the proponent is meeting conditions that they've promised.
Okay, are you okay with what's on paper in terms of
No.
the conditions that just to be clear, then you don't think there's enough assessment to make sure that the companies are abiding by what they commit to, but you don't even think the commitments that the province is requiring them to sign on to are enough.
Exactly, and again, that's also based on having done some research and looking at what the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has said. And they said that, look, we can't be certain that there's going to be, that you're leaving enough water in the stream that fish will be able to migrate. And then what is that impact going to be on those wild fish populations? And let alone that also that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans furthermore said about this project that they've seen considerable noncompliance on other projects, that they've looked at other projects and they've seen that the success rate of complying, and it's called IFR, and that's an in-stream flow requirement. And all that means is that the proponent has said, we'll leave this amount of water in the stream. And what DFO has seen is that the success rate with that has been very low, and also that there's considerable noncompliance on these projects. And so what the Wilderness Committee is saying, and steelhead associations and fly fisher associations and increasingly other environmental groups, is you shouldn't be playing Russian roulette with our creeks and rivers in British Columbia with these projects. That there's very little oversight. And they also come with blasting, they come with road networks, they come with transmission lines. It's not just a little turbine in the creek. And of course the Kokish is a high concern, and there's many red flags just because the project is situated right smack dab in the middle of salmon, dolly varden, and char habitat.
So do you want no development, period, full stop, or would you be
We're
satisfied?
calling for a complete moratorium across British Columbia. And the Kokish is just an example of one of the lack of environmental standards that are applying to these projects. That we have a gold rush right now. You have over 800 creeks and rivers that are staked in British Columbia for these projects. And increasingly, you're seeing lakes that are also staked. And we're seeing problem after problem. We aren't seeing enough water left in for fish. We aren't seeing proper environmental checks and balances. We're seeing problems with erosion. We're seeing problems with transmission lines. We're seeing problems with the massive road networks that come in. And so we're saying, hey, let's take a deep breath. There's a way to do green power right, but this isn't the way to do it.
All right, because I was going to ask you, you want a complete moratorium, but you want that to redesign the process, do you, rather than to never consider run-of-river
well, we're actually
so-called
calling
green
for
hydroelectric power?
we have 4 criteria, and we say we need to have proper planning, because astoundingly, There's no planning anywhere in BC for these projects. And so you're seeing projects situated in inappropriate places, such as the Kokish, right in the middle of important fish habitat. Then we're saying high environmental standards. 3, we'd say the projects need to be acceptable to the First Nations and local communities. And 4, we call for public ownership because of long-term energy planning, energy security, better transparency, and accountability. And that's not to say that you couldn't have the private power sector involved in design, build, and appropriate projects. But again, these we don't need the power in British Columbia. This power was always destined for California. And then California said, you know what, we don't consider run-of-river power to be green. We consider it to have too big an impact on the environment and especially on stream health.
But that's what I want to get back to that question then.
Yeah.
I mean, when you call for a moratorium right now, are you really trying to say this should never happen? I mean, will you ever be satisfied? Do you think it will ever be green technology?
No, it shouldn't happen the way it's been happening. And right now what's happening is the public doesn't have a say. You have exceptionally low environmental standards. And just to give you an idea, the Ministry of Environment in British Columbia has been cut by over 50% in the last 10 years.
Sure, and those cuts and the difficulties enforcing regulations on the ground, I think, have been well documented. What I want to understand from you is what kind of rough guidelines would be acceptable? What proportions of the river flow being protected would be acceptable to you in the future?
Well, we'd say definitely wouldn't have projects in fish habitat. And again, just alluding back to the 4 criteria that I mentioned. So you need to have planning. You need to say what's an appropriate place to have these power projects, what's an inappropriate place to have them. You need to have high environmental standards. And again, we have sort of rock-bottom environmental standards because the Ministry of Environment has been gutted. The projects need to be acceptable to First Nations and local communities had their voice taken away with the passage of Bill 30, which removes their right to zone for these projects. And then 4th, we do call for public ownership, but that even if the Kokish was being proposed by BC Hydro, we'd say it was a terrible project. And you also have to look, you have to say, does BC need the power? And if you don't need the power, or you can lead with conservation, or you can get power from the downstream benefits from the Columbia River Treaty, and we're entitled to quite a significant amount of power from those benefits, then we'd say, hey, let's just take a deep breath, let's put a moratorium on these projects and figure out the right and the wrong way to do low-carbon energy, because right now people are very concerned, and understandably so.
We have a minute left, Gwen, but I want to ask you finally what you think the political likelihood of any of that happening is. The government and BC Hydro have committed to this. They say they're following environmental protocols and so on. Do you think this is likely to stop anytime soon?
I think it actually could, because this is driven by something that's called a self-sufficiency standard. And that meant it's a bloated standard, and it required BC Hydro to purchase far more energy than it needed, because it had to look at every year being a critical low water year. And again, that was driven by the BC government wanting to sell power to California, but have BC Hydro take the risk. And a couple of months ago, the BC government had their own independent panel that said, hey, you need to look at this bloated definition of self-sufficiency. And if they do that, then you could see BC Hydro stopping these calls for power. And so I could see these projects stopping. And the way they're being built right now, with just rock-bottom environmental standards and no planning, is a recipe for disaster. And that's why you're seeing very poorly planned projects for salmon streams like the Kokish River.
Well, Gwen Barlee, thank you for joining us this morning to discuss it. I'm glad you have the time.
My pleasure.
Gwen Barlee is Policy Director with the Wilderness Committee, which, by the way, used to be called the Western Canada Wilderness Committee, in case you're confused. And we have asked for an interview with BC's Environmental Assessment Office.